Hey everyone, this is Scott from ServantMedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be going over LiteSpeed Cache. The current version that I'm working on is 3.0.86, which is part of the 3.0 branch. The last video I did was covering version 2.0, and this major release has changed virtually everything. Nothing is in the same spot. There are new features. I would go over the general changelog, but let's just go ahead and dig into the plugin. When you first install it, you get this nice little menu on the left-hand side for LiteSpeed Cache. Unlike the older version, everything is now broken up into different submenus, which can make it a little bit harder if you're following older tutorials, so this one should help you. So the dashboard area is basically just a general information of the various services they run. quic.cloud is a cloud CDN service started by the LiteSpeed guys. Basically, as I mentioned, it's a beta test. It's sort of like Cloudflare in the sense that it can cache your HTML as well and serve it to your users from the closest server. So it's a mixture of like Cloudflare where you can serve your HTML, your CSS, and your JS from the cloud, but it uses LiteSpeed's tech to further accelerate the delivery speed of your website. Now, the thing about quic Cloud is it is only really meant to work with the LiteSpeed plugin. The advantage, though, of this is, say you're on Cloudways, for instance, as your host, but you want to be able to use the LiteSpeed plugin, you can use the quic.cloud service as your CDN, which allows you to benefit from a lot of the existing features in the LiteSpeed Cache plugin. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to go over that service anymore because it is a premium service, and I just want to show you the general configuration for this plugin. So you have your general page load time information, and you have to use their domain key to get any of this extra info. But we're going to jump right over here into your general settings. So when you install this plugin, you have this nice little general settings tab. This is where you're going to put your domain if you have a quic.cloud service. You can choose to enable automatic updates. My general advice is with plugins that have impacts on the front end, so things that are not like WordPress, which are security based, I typically recommend not having them automatically upgrade, solely because if something goes wrong and you didn't take a backup before it updated, you're now going to be either spending a lot of time or quite a bit of money to get them restored and back to normal. So I recommend just turning this off. And then for notifications, if you turn the option on, it'll show you the latest news, updates, and whatnot as a giant notification. I also have that off because I find it to be quite annoying. Now we're going to go into the cache setting. Keep in mind if you're on LiteSpeed or if you're using quic.cloud, you will not have this notice. This is on a Apache Nginx setup, so I'm going to get that warning. You should make sure that enable caching is on. You can then choose to cache for logged in users in addition to logged out users. My general advice with this is you shouldn't cache for logged in users if you're running a website like BuddyPress, BBPress, anything where users are being served dynamic content. Typically, I don't ever recommend having this option on, so it's normally the safe bet to go ahead and just have it disabled. You could choose to cache commenters. What this does is it will cache commenters that have pending comments. Basically, when you send a comment to WordPress, it typically assigns a cookie, and most caching plugins will bypass that post cache for the user that presents that cookie. That way, it'll let them know that their comment is pending. What this does says, well, since the comment isn't necessarily approved yet, we're not going to serve them an uncached version of the page. I recommend enabling this option in most situations. If you're using anything like WP Discuss, then you'll want to make sure that it's still working correctly. A lot of the custom comment plugins may have issues with enabling this option. You can also cache the WordPress REST API. I totally recommend doing that. REST API calls can be quite slow and heavy sometimes, so go ahead and leave this option as on. You could choose to cache the login page. Caching the login page can sometimes cause some weird effects. My general advice, just don't bother caching it. They say that you can cache it. Just go ahead and be careful. If you use anything that customizes the login page, you may have issues with it. You may also have issues if you use something like a RE captcha on those pages. There may be an issue with the plugin that's setting the verification token. I typically just bypass that page, and then what I do is I use Cloudflare to lock down the login URL. to avoid any issues. You could choose to cache your favicon.ico request. I totally recommend doing that. A lot of times the favicon ICO request is always requested, especially if there is no icon that is present on the page. So caching that will reduce server load because it'll cut out some of the lookup and the redirects that may be occurring. You could choose to cache PHP resources. So sometimes a plugin will serve an asset like a CSS or JS file as .php. And this will allow those resources to be cached, which will reduce the impact on the server. I recommend enabling that option. This is an issue commonly with a plugin called Add Custom CSS. It loads it as a dynamic PHP file, which works for allowing you to easily update it without users being served a cached version. But it's a lot slower because it is a PHP request, and the server does have to process that request, so it should be cached. You can choose to cache mobile views separately. This is only really necessary if you're using AMP or a mobile specific theme. If you're using any modern theme, it should just work out of the box. You don't need to cache it separately. If you're doing a PHP check, maybe to load an asset conditionally or load a section of a page conditionally, you'll also need to enable it. List of mobile user agents. You can typically just leave this option as is. This will cover pretty much everything major. You can include private cache URLs. So these are URLs that contain query strings that will not be cached. These are just exclusion rules. You can choose to include them here as need be, but typically I don't bother too much. And then one thing they do is drop query strings. What this does is it ignores certain query strings when caching. So they have UTM, Facebook Click, Google Analytics. Those are all good suggestions. What happens is if you visit a URL, oftentimes it's with some social media platform like Facebook, you'll notice they append a query string that seems like it's a mile long at the end of the URL. This just says, okay, well, that query string doesn't really matter because the content isn't going to change for that query string, so we're going to cache it anyways. This is a good fix. It will make sure that pages that are served for Facebook will receive a cached URL. So now we're going to go to the TTL page. TTL is just how long a page or item is to be cached for. So they say the private cache is 1800 seconds, so 30 minutes. The public cache, which is like the pages, are cached for 1 week. That should be fine. Your front page cache is a week. Your default feed TTL is a week. That should be fine as well. If you publish very frequently though, you'll want to make sure that you lower the amount of time. Say you publish once a day, I would set this to 1 day and the equivalent amount of seconds just to avoid any issues. The same thing with the REST API. If you're using the REST API for any sort of app, mobile app, you may want to lower this. And if you set this to anything lower than 30 seconds, it should just prevent it from being cached altogether. And then you have default HTTP status code page. This will specify an HTTP status code and the number of seconds to cache said page. So your 404 page will be cached for 3600 seconds. That's an acceptable amount of time. If you have a 404 page that's getting hammered a lot, this can severely reduce the impact on your server. 404 pages are typically bypassed on cache using something like W3 Total Cache, and that's to avoid serving a 200 as a status code instead of a 404. This plugin, though, you don't have to worry about that with the 404 page. So a 3600 is a acceptable lifespan for it to be cached. Under the Purge section, this is when you can modify what gets purged. You can even set up a purge schedule. We'll go ahead and look at this. You can choose to purge all on upgrade. So anytime a plugin, theme, or WordPress core is updated, it gets purged. I recommend that stays that way. You can choose to purge stale. So what this does, if a stale copy of a cache page is shown to a visitor, it basically, if the user gets served a page, let's say your cache span is set to 1 week, but you have a page that's been cached for a week and 1 day, just as an example. And that's what's known as a stale cache. It is a page that should be regenerated. So this will make sure, hey, that user will get served that stale page and that it's purged to automatically regenerate for the viewer who waits. So the next viewer will get served a non-stale version. The person who does visit it will get served the stale version. This just reduces server load, and it's honestly fine for most websites. Auto purging for publications and updates of posts. You could choose what types of content get purged when a new post or page is published. I typically just recommend unchecking the monthly archive. Date archives are honestly pretty useless in my opinion. They serve virtually no SEO value. I disable them outright. And then the only one I would always change is the all pages with recent post widget. Unless you're using the default recent post widget, this doesn't really do anything. And if you are, and you have it on your sidebar, let's say, and you have 5,000 posts in cache, and you purge the entire cache, well, now all those pages are now out of cache, which can cause a huge spike in your server load if you're using if you have this option enabled. That being said, if you don't enable this option and you are using it, users may not get the most recent post appearing in that sidebar. So it's a bit of a give and a take. If you want the best user experience, it's probably better to leave this option checked. If you want to get the best performance, I would uncheck it to avoid too many cache clearings, especially if you have a very large website. You could choose to go ahead and specify a scheduled purge time. So specify the time to purge the scheduled purge URLs list. This just allows you to set a time on the server when something needs to be purged to go ahead and run it at that specific time. Maybe you want to make sure you only do it off peak to maximize the load time and to reduce server load. You could set it to like 1 a.m. That would give you the most optimal load time. So at 1 a.m., the scheduled purge URLs will be purged. That's going to give you the optimal load time. It may have an impact on user experience for getting served stale pages, but doing it off peak will save you server resources. So if you're on a very large website and you have purge URLs scheduled up here, I would just make sure you do it off peak. And then you have your purge all hooks. These are hooks that are checked. And so for instance, if you update or delete a navigation menu under appearance menus, then the entire cache will be purged. You can choose to add or remove them here, and they have their recommended list here that you can just copy in here as if you need to revert. The exclusions just allow you to exclude a variety of posts, pages, cookies, and user agents from the cache. You can also choose to not cache for roles. So if we rewind a little bit, when I disabled the logged in user cache, if you wanted to leave that cache enabled for any reason, you could just simply exclude the administrator and anyone who has write access. So if you had subscribers who could log into your website, let's say it's some kind of membership website, you can allow them to get a cached version of the page, but make sure that the only users who get it are subscribers. That way, anyone who has write access still gets the optimal changes, everything works, your Elementor page builder still works, and everything gets updated in real time, but your subscribers who may log in are not hammering your server. I will note, I would still not use this for BBPress, BuddyPress, or WooCommerce. You can get some really weird effects by using this. ESI is the Edgeside Includes. So this is a very unique feature for them. This is from when a page may be served from cache for logged in users. It allows you to designate parts of your dynamic page as separate fragments. If you've ever used W3 Total Cache, this is their equivalent of fragment caching. So if you have a bit of dynamic content that is loading for your logged in users, you could choose to only serve the non-dynamic bits as from cache. The problem with this is when you're working with very large applications that are supposed to be completely dynamic like BuddyPress, it almost becomes a complete waste of time to implement this. If you're using, maybe, let's just say you have Paid Memberships Pro installed. What you could do is, let's say you have a little bar in your main menu that shows like a profile and their little image and it says their name. And you want to say, okay, well, they're logged in and they're only able to access and read the content that was previously logged. So there's no dynamic BBPress pages, no BuddyPress pages. You just allowed them to log in, and you want to make sure that their profile and their image and their name still shows up in the right-hand corner. You could set up Edgeside Includes to make sure only that bit is not cached. So the rest of it's cached, which will reduce the overall server time, the load time, and reduce the load on the server. Unfortunately, it's complicated to fill up, to set up, and I'm not going to go through the entire setup process. They have documentation on how to use this. It is very much a developer feature. It is not user-friendly in the slightest, but they do allow you to automatically exclude the admin bar and the comment form if you so wish. We're going to go to the object cache settings. So my server has memcached and Redis installed, but I primarily use Redis. You would want to make sure that you have this enabled if you have either memcached or Redis installed, and select the one that you use. I'm a fan of Redis personally over memcached. I tend to get better performance out of it, so I would go ahead and set up to use Redis. If you're on Cloudways, memcached is automatically installed, and I have a video on how to set up and install the Redis extension. In that video, I used another free plugin to handle it, but you could just skip that bit and install the Redis, and then you could use this plugin to set it up. One thing that I will note is if you have a username and password set up on your server, or your host has one set up, you're going to need that info to get this bit working. Once you do that, though, everything else is pretty much the default settings, and you'll get the optimal load time. One thing to do is you can cache the WP admin. You may encounter some expired data. Basically, what will happen sometimes in certain configurations, it's a very weird issue. Let's say you deactivate a plugin and your page reloads and that plugin is still active. So then you go to deactivate it again, and then it says it's an expired link, or the plugin was already deactivated and the function fails to disable it. That is sometimes going to happen. You don't notice it very frequently, and I've only had it happen on like one client site that I've had on Cloudways, and it was just that same scenario of I deactivated a plugin, I refreshed the page, it still showed it as active, I deactivated it again, and it said it was already deactivated. It happens, so just keep that in mind. But the flip side of that is the WP admin panel is quite slow sometimes. So this can greatly improve the backend performance if you have, say, WooCommerce installed where you're managing a large set of data. So that's just something to keep in mind. I'm not going to save these options because I'm just walking you through them. The browser cache settings, please make sure you have browser caching enabled, and they have it set for 52 weeks, 1 day, and 6 hours. That is a very interesting setup. I guess they're trying to account for a leap year? I'm not really sure what this is for, but anyway, the browser cache should be set for a year. That's going to control your CSS, your JS, your images, and make sure that they're stored in the browser. This will not do the caching for your HTML files, which is good. You don't want to have your HTML saved in the browser. It's going to cause you a whole lot of headaches. And then under the advanced settings, you have this login cookie. They said there's a default login cookie. You shouldn't need to mess with this. You could choose to improve HTTP and HTTPS compatibility. One thing I will note is you should never, ever serve the URL from both HTTP and HTTPS. Set up a redirect and save yourself a bunch of headache. It's honestly, this feature is probably left in here for some very rare edge cases, but you should never have HTTP and HTTPS on the same domain. It's just not worth it. And then one of the cool features is instant click. If you've ever used the plugin Flying Pages, this works just like that. What it does is you hover over a link and it'll begin to preload that page. The advantage of this is say a user is on your store and they're hovering over the link to visit your product. Well, this will tell the browser to begin downloading that specific product before the user clicks the link. So the idea is they hover over it, they're more likely to click on it. The downside of this is two things. It will increase the server load, and it could cause performance issues on some specific layouts. So if you have a lot of content organized in a grid, let's just say you have a 4x4 grid of posts that are images, and on hover it reveals the title. What will happen is users who may hover over 3 of the posts trying to read the title may begin downloading 3 posts in the background. that can consume a lot of server resources and can slow down the browsing speed because now the browser's fetching 3 pages worth of assets and it didn't need to visit any of them. So this is a very tricky feature. You have to test it a little bit. If you've ever used something like Hotjar, you can get an idea of what pages users are actually clicking on, and it'll heat map their activity. That may be useful before implementing something like instant click / flying pages. But when it does work, it really makes the experience feel seamless. We can go into the CDN settings. This is just like every CDN section of any plugin ever. If you're using something like their quic Cloud CDN, you just check this option. If you're using virtually any other CDN, what you'll do is turn this feature on. So if you're using something like Key CDN, where it gives you a URL to rewrite, you'll put the URL in here. You can choose which asset types to include or exclude, and include directories or exclude directories. There's one additional setting in here to load jQuery remotely. My general advice is I'd never enable this for a couple of reasons. Oftentimes I try to bundle jQuery if I can and load it in the footer with the rest of the scripts. When you use a service like this, it typically prevents you from doing that because it's being merged with the rest of your JS. So there's not really a reason to do it. And the general thought process is you're expecting the user's browser to already have the jQuery library cached from the Google CDN. This is a bit of an iffy feature. Sometime I don't really ever notice a time when users' experience goes up from using these features. Using something like Cloudflare's browser insights, you can get an idea. I never really notice a noticeable improvement from using these options when I measure via that method, but you can if you so wish. You can also use the Cloudflare API here. This will just allow you to purge the Cloudflare assets. You'll include your email, your API key, and the domain. The image optimization feature, if you're using the quic Cloud feature, it will allow you to compress your images. We're going to skip past this page because I don't have it set up, but we're going to look at the options real quick. So this is pretty similar if you've ever used like Short Pixel or any of the other plugins I've referred to on this channel. You have the auto request cron. This will automatically request the cron job, request optimization via a cron job. This is basically scheduled optimization. If you have images that you upload frequently, this will allow them to be scheduled. Auto pull cron, if you disabling this, will stop the cron job responsible for pulling optimized images back to the cloud image server. Basically what this does is your server will send the images out to quic.cloud. They will do all the compressing and all the conversion on their server. The advantage is this is workable on situations when you have very low CPU power because you're offloading all that heavy work onto another server. Just make sure that you have this option on if you are using that feature. Otherwise, you won't be able to get those images back, which won't prevent them from working. You just won't be getting the optimized images back. They'll just stay over there on their server. The optimized original images will optimize the main image you upload. So if you upload example.png, that image will be compressed if you have this option enabled. If you don't enable this, what will happen is that full-sized version of the image, which oftentimes I see people using the full-sized version, will not be compressed. So the general advice is just always make sure the original image gets uploaded and that you have a backup. And then you could choose to remove the original backups, automatically remove the original image backups after fetching optimized images. If you do this, you will have no way of restoring your images in case the image quality goes terrible. Now, if you have a backup, offsite preferably, you can restore that using your offsite backup. But just keep in mind that if you don't do that and you go through and you compress all your images and most of them look like they were like watercolors and you sprayed a hose all over it, they're not gonna look really good. You'll have no way of restoring them. You could choose to optimize images losslessly instead of the default lossy compression. So if you're concerned about image quality and you enable this option, it will allow you to remove your EXIF data and the reduce file size, but it won't reduce the image quality at all. Keep this in mind. If you're a photography website, this may be what you want to go for. If you want to preserve EXIF data for whatever reason, you can do so here. It will increase the size of your images because that data can be quite large and is ultimately quite useless for most websites. But if you're a photography website, again, and you want to preserve that data on your images, just make sure that you have this option on. And I would also have the losslessly compression option enabled as well if you're a photography-based website. You could choose to create WebP versions of your images. Now, one thing about WebP images are they're inherently a lossy compression. So even if you're a photography website and you did all those above the options, if you're using WebP images, it's going to have some image quality degradation. It's typically not a noticeable amount, but it will reduce the file size quite substantially because WebP is just a more efficient image format all around. So when you enable this option, you can then choose to use image WebP replacement, which will go out and replace images in your HTML with their WebP equivalent. And then you can also choose to enable the replacement of WebP and source set elements, which I also recommend. This is for images that are outside of the general WordPress logic. So maybe you have a custom plugin that's adding images, maybe a MetaBox plugin or advanced custom fields, something along those lines, and you're doing some weird stuff. This will just make sure that they're also being served as WebP. And then you have the WordPress image quality control. By default, WordPress compresses JPEG images at a quality of 82. That was decided upon, I think it was originally 90, and they decided upon it that the image quality reduction was virtually so minimal that 82 gave a decent enough compression level without having any noticeable impact on image quality. I wouldn't really mess with this option, but if you want to disable it, set it to 100, and that effectively disables it. Now, the page optimization is where all the Minify options live. They all live happily together in this section. We are going to play around with this just a little bit because we can. So the CSS Minify will minify your CSS files, like every plugin. The CSS Combine option will combine those files. Reload your page, and bam, you got this nice little CSS file minified in the header, and it looks great. No HTML comments virtually, except for it says this file is auto-generated, which is the WordPress core files. So that's acceptable. Then you can enable HTTP2 push. If you have a server that has the HTTP2 protocol enabled, you can enable server push. What server push does is it tells the browser to start downloading the assets before the rest of the HTML document has been found. So there's not really an easy way for me to explain this, but basically your browser, when it's downloading the HTML, here it is, yeah, it includes a link to the CSS file, and it tells it, hey, start downloading this resource right away instead of having to wait for it. So if you have a giant JS file in the footer, you can push it during the initial load process, which won't make it render blocking, but it allows the asset to begin downloading sooner. I typically enable this. I typically always recommend this option if your server actually supports it. You can load the CSS asynchronously. Asynchronous CSS will require their online services. What this will do is it will try, if you have this option enabled, to generate critical CSS. The critical CSS of your page is basically all the CSS that's in theory required to render the top half of your page. So everything in this initial viewport, basically everything down to this word general, will have its critical CSS extracted from your CSS file, inserted into the header as inline CSS, and your CSS file will be loaded in the footer asynchronously. That way it's no longer render blocking. This can improve your render performance if you have a very large and complicated website. However, on the flip side, when you use this option, you may have some weird effects during the loading process. Your images may not load in the right spot. They may be too large. Your text may have the wrong font. And sometimes assets will have different colors. So you just have to test it. That's really the only way to deal with this, is to test it and see what happens. One thing you can do is separate the CSS, the critical CSS cache post types. Basically, what this will do is you can choose a post type where every item in there will have its own critical CSS generated. Do not do this for your posts. I would never insert post in here, especially if you have a very large website. I would use the page though. Typically pages have their own distinct layouts, like your about page and your contact page may have a nice little header image, and that may change page to page. your post will almost never have styling elements like that change. And the more post types that you do this on, the more space on your server that's going to get used. And honestly, the more work that has to be done for the browser. I would just not enable this option except for pages. So I would only insert page in here just like this. Because otherwise you're having you're having a different critical CSS file generated for every single page. And it's just not beneficial to anybody. You could choose to separate the critical CSS cache URLs as well. So separate critical CSS files will be generated for a path containing these strings. You can choose to include query strings in here where if you have a page and let's just say you have example.com/pixelbuds and you have a query string at the end that's a query string and then it says equals a black, for instance. So you have the black pixelbuds on there. You can choose to separate and create their own critical CSS for those query strings. You typically don't need to do this, but if you notice that you're having weird renderings with your specific setup, go ahead and include it here. But really, you should almost never need to do this except for some really far edge cases. You could choose to inline the CSS async library. So basically, you could choose to load the JavaScript library either inline or as a file. Let me see if I can find the file. No, it's because I don't have the service. But basically, it'll just add the JS file as either inlined or it will add it as a file. Typically, inlining it is totally fine. That way, it's not render blocking. Under the font display optimization, I recommend swap. Always swap the fonts. What swap does is if you have a Google font, for instance, this will make the fonts load a fallback font first. So the fallback font will load in, and it's normally something generic. It's saved in the browser by default as a default system safe font. And then when your Google font is downloaded, it will swap that font in. The advantage to this method is normally if you're using Google fonts, what will happen is because it's a font file and the browser needs to fetch that file, it is not able to display any text until that font file gets downloaded. That can leave large periods, especially on mobile devices, where they're not able to read any of the text. By swapping it, you're then able to get the text readable, and then the styling will kick in after it's downloaded. That's just the best way to handle it, in my opinion. So JS Benify is the exact same thing as the above. You click to enable it, and then you can choose to combine. And then you can choose to enable the HTTP2 push, which I recommend, and you should also load the JS as deferred. And then you have something called load inline JS. So you could choose to load inline JS after the DOM is fully loaded, or then you can choose to, which is this option, or this can increase the JS compatibility and reduce JS errors when the previous option. They recommend setting deferred. Basically, if you have inline JavaScript, this will attempt to make that JavaScript load after your main merged JavaScript file. So let's see if I can get this. So as you can see right here, this was an inline script. They rewrote it to be a data URI. So it's a base64 encoded version of that JavaScript. They set it as a source attribute, and then they loaded it with defer. So this can help in situations where your main JavaScript file, which is now included in the header, but still deferred, will still function. So if you're using something like Revolution Slider, where you'll have assets that are inlined and are dependent on scripts being loaded before it, this can help prevent issues. Really, it's just a nice way of improving your website's load time. And it's a pretty clever workaround too. The only thing that I would keep in mind is this doesn't work for all scripts, and it can break certain scripts as well. If you have third-party scripts particularly, this can break them. It happens a lot when people try to use this method. Just make sure that if you have anything inline that's from a third party, that it still works. Notably, analytics scripts are prone to breakage. One thing you can do to avoid pretty much all your issues, though, and not needing to use this option, is to exclude jQuery from the optimization. It'll prevent it from being combined and minified and deferred. That's pretty much the safe option. I wouldn't mess too much with the load inline JS if you can, because it's prone to causing issues. Under the optimization settings, we got plenty of options in this plugin, I will say that. But you can set the TTL for the CSS and the JS cache. By default, it's 1 week, totally acceptable. The HTML minify option, I recommend enabling the HTML minify option. You could choose to minify inline CSS. That's typically a safe operation. Inline JS minify might run into issues. The reason for that is a lot of inline scripts may not adhere to whatever their minify engine is. So sometimes people will inline scripts and they may have a P tag somewhere in their inline JS. This could cause it to break because of it may spit out a syntax error. So for most websites, you should probably just enable inline CSS minify, HTML minify, and don't enable inline JS minify. But if you want, you can go ahead and test it and hope that it doesn't break anything. The most performant option is to minify all of it. DNS prefetching is a bit of a tricky business. You effectively want to include DNS requests that are going to be requested later in the document. So for instance, Google Fonts typically load fonts.googleapis.com as their DNS prefetch. You can also do fonts.gstatic.com, which is the actual WAF URLs that are requested, and you can put them there. Or you can widely enable DNS prefetch for URLs in the document. This can improve the DNS prefetch control. Basically, you kind of put your hands up and you say, all right, you deal with it. And let's see if it does anything. And it looks like it decided to fetch this request from the WordPress.org servers for the emoji.js. So the most performant option is just to let them try and figure it out, because obviously it's quite confusing for the average user to determine what what requests need to be prefetched. Removing comments, this will just remove comments that are found inside of CSS and JS files. This will improve the performance because it'll make the file size smaller. For instance, this CSS file had a comment, and it will remove CSS comments that are found within the file. We're gonna just leave it at that. Then you have the remove query strings option. This will just remove query strings. Google RE captcha is bypassed because that will break with this option. By default, this is pretty simple and straightforward. There's not really a reason not to enable it, because most of your assets that have query strings added are your CSS and your JS files, but you're already merging them so they have a dynamic URL anyways. So wouldn't worry too much. But you can go ahead and enable it if you so wish. Loading Google Fonts asynchronously. I don't recommend the web font loader. The reason I don't recommend the web font loader is it's because it's quite a bulky JS library that doesn't provide nearly the amount of benefits of just loading them as a CSS file with preload. The web font library is just quite bulky. I don't really recommend using it, and it will hurt your page speed insight scores if you do run it. So I would just not worry about it. You could choose to remove all Google Fonts. You can do that, but most people will say that the appearance is quite ugly after doing that. But you will get a noticeable improvement in your performance if you don't have Google Fonts, but at the same time, then your site's not going to look anything like it did before. You could choose to remove the emoji.js. I recommend enabling that option. Media settings, you could choose to lazy load the images here. This will just load your images as they come into viewport. It works virtually the same as every other lazy load plugin. You could choose responsive placeholders. This will basically set a placeholder that is the dimensions of the image that were originally set. That's totally fine. I would use this and use this. You could choose to use a basic placeholder here as a base 64, but we've enabled the responsive placeholder. We're going to use that. The cloud generator, this is a low quality image placeholder. Basically what this does is, let's say you have an image that's 1920 by 1080. It will take an image and it will compress it and it will resize that image. Well, it'll make it basically, It'll make it so ugly that it's illegible on purpose. That way, when the image loads in, it kind of feels a bit more progressive, because the image quality gets effectively better as the image starts loading in, and this just makes it really small. I don't ever really recommend using this option. It arguably is better for user experience because it feels more natural, but my issue with it is why? Lazy loading is pretty well established now, and so long as the user has a decent connection and your lazy load script isn't loading too late, the experience is virtually the same. I wouldn't use this option personally, but it exists. You have the lazy load iframes option. I do recommend enabling that, and then I do not recommend inline loading the lazy load images library.js. I just recommend loading it as a regular JS file. That's ideal, and it will be merged with the rest of your JS. Media exclusions, you could choose to exclude a variety of images and iframes based on classes, names, parent classes, URLs, all in the media excludes for the lazy load option. You have the discussion settings. I do recommend caching gravitars if you can. Gravitars are woefully unoptimized. These should just be set like this. Finally, we have the tuning settings. You can choose the combined CSS priority will load before other CSS files. That's typically fine. Your CSS files are being merged in this scenario. There's not really a reason to load this. Your combined JS priority will load the merged JS file before other JS files that may be excluded. These are really just meant to help diagnose issues with merging CSS and JS. Sometimes you have an inline, you have a CSS or JS file that need to be loaded after the other files that were excluded. The only thing I would ever really touch in here is if you need to exclude a file from being minified or combined, you can include them here. And then you may need to increase your combined file size. I really hope not. But if you have more than 2 megs of CSS that need to be merged, you can bump this up, and this will allow up to 5 megs of uncompressed CSS and JS to be merged. Really, the problem with that is if you have that many assets, you're just asking for trouble, because that is a lot of CSS and a lot of JS to be loaded. But if you so wish, there is a way to do this. Finally, we have the database optimization. This settings panel is much nicer than the old one. I will admit that was one of my gripes with the older one. Basically, you have your various options in here, and you can choose to clean all. And then there is the purge option for their own CSS and JS files. I don't know why this is in here. I personally would just say they should just remove this. But virtually, this clean all will never be green because you have transients that are constantly being generated. But it is a nice one-click way of reducing your database size. As you can see here, it lists your auto-loaded data as well. Conventional wisdom says your auto-load data size should never be larger than 1 meg. If it is, you're going to have serious performance issues. The auto-loaded data is mostly plugin settings, and it's in the WordPress options table. Auto-load data is always going to be loaded on any URL request, unless you're serving a cached version via a page caching plugin. But more or less, if your auto-loaded data size is 1 meg or more, and I have seen it that large, I've seen up to 2 megs where something got really out of control. This will help you figure out what the problem child is by listing out the largest auto-loaded data size. And then one other thing is they give you an engine converter. What this will do is if you have a MyISAM engine table in your database, this will allow you to convert it to InnoDB, which is just more performant in almost every application that I've found. I've never found a situation where MyISAM was any faster. And then under the database optimization settings, you could choose to include a number of revisions. So you can choose the max number of revisions that are allowed to be kept. It's set to 0. It's totally fine. And then the revisions max age allows you to specify, let's say you've been working on your website and you want to keep the last 30 days of revisions, but you want to clean out all those older ones. You can do so right here. You would just set it to 30. The crawler option, and we're really coming down to the wire here in anything that's important. The crawler cron it's a preload function. It allows them to go out and pre-cache the pages so that way your first user gets the best experience. This is totally acceptable. If you want to run it manually, you're able to do so right here by just using the manually run. And if you also push the R command, it will go ahead and run it. You can choose to give it it has the name, and it's honestly just relatively simple. There's not any reason to modify this too much. If you have a sitemap, you can choose to list a sitemap list here. If you have your website, just go ahead and run it manually. It'll go out, it'll pre-cache the page, and it looks like it has 3 pages that are waiting to be cached. And it's just a really nice page. As you can see here, it lists out the URLs that it finds, and it gives you a status code of whether it was able to be cached or not. And if you find a URL that the crawler finds that it determines is uncacheable, you can add it to a blacklist. Honestly, this is such a convoluted way of doing a crawler. One thing I recommend though is you set up a crawler cron and that you have your delay at a reasonable interval. 500 microseconds is probably fine for most hosting platforms. And then the rest of the defaults are decent. You really just wanted to have a crawler cron, that way your posts are automatically being preloaded. You could do a crawler simulation, which allows the crawler to fake being a logged in user to preload pages if it so wishes. And then you can include a sitemap. This is where you're going to paste your Yoast SEO sitemap, and then it will be fine. My issue with this crawler is it's really complicated. All you need really is to go to your general settings, turn on the crawler cron, and then if you wanted to have a preload a logged in user, enter the user ID here to be simulated as, but then go to your sitemap settings and paste the URL of your sitemap here. All you need to do. Finally, and then you have this little toolbox, which is just a lot of their other options combined. You could choose to purge your cache for a variety of pages or to purge the assets. You could choose to purge a post by the category, post ID, tag, or URL. You'll include them there in a list. You can import and export your settings. You could choose to edit your htaccess file or modify the path settings. Under the heartbeat control, which honestly this should be moved probably under the general settings, I would say. Enable the front end heartbeat control. You can increase the interval to something like 120. Back end heartbeat control, enable it 120. Editor heartbeat control 120. If you want to disable it on your front end, all you have to do is come over to here and type in 0, and now it will never load the heartbeats on the front end. Then you click your save, and you go to your report. This is just a nice means of helping them diagnose issues with your setup. Debug settings allows you to, this should really only ever be used by the developers to resolve an issue and to figure out useful information. You can get the debug log, and if you wish to be a beta tester, you are able to do so. Wow, this plugin is a lot. Tons of options, great performance. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below. It is a lot of options. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button, and thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.